you have choices about where you spend your time and how you account for the time that you spent. And it's not like you won't have opportunities to brief the board on your key initiatives. Like you'll have that opportunity. You'll be given time to do it. It's a question of whether you're spending that time in a way that helps educate and inform, such that you can become a trusted partner.
SC Media, our diamond sponsor Savient, and our sapphire sponsor Bitwarden are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of the Cyber Risk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Andy Jaquith, Managing Director of MarkerBench and a longtime CISO. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Todd. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I actually, before we get started, I do want to know what attracted you to cybersecurity, but I have your book right here, Security Metrics.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind. I get a royalty of about $3.50 per book, so it's a little bit like buying me a beer. So thank you for doing that.
Well,
I got into cyber by accident, by the way. So, sorry, I got into cyber quite by accident. I had a boss of mine. I was working at Cambridge Technology Partners in the late '90s, and a boss of mine said, "Hey, do you want to do a startup?" And I said, "Well, I don't know too much about startups, but this is the dot-com bubble. A lot of people are apparently getting rich doing startups, so sure, I'm interested." And he said, "Well, it's in security." And we didn't even have the word cybersecurity then. It was sort of network security, or maybe even information security, or data security if you were lucky. And I said, "Sure, I'd like that, but I don't know anything about it." And he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You'll learn." So that's how I got into it, sort of by accident, but and partially propelled by greed. Although in reality it was kind of just curiosity, and I this is where I worked with the Loft and Weld and Mudge and Dill and a whole cast of characters, Alex Stamos to name a few. I mean, Royal Hansen. It goes on and on and on. It's was quite a place to be from, but that's how I got into it. Just working with some incredibly bright people that I learned a lot of my craft from.
Yeah, and we all learn from all kinds of different people, and it's interesting. You talk about the book. I've learned from your book. I think it's a great book on security metrics. As a writer myself, I published the CISO Compass book, and we just recently released the Privacy Leaders Compass book. And, as a roadmap for chief privacy officers, just like the roadmap for chief security officers. And I know what you mean by, it's like the farmer and the tomato, right? By the time the farmer gets paid for the tomato, everybody else has had their cut along the way. But I wanted to ask you, you said you work for Cambridge Technology Partners. Now, I don't know if I have the right firm or not, but I remember years back when I was working for American Airlines, I thought that was the company. And I think his name was Donovan, possibly.
Sure. John Donovan.
And I have a book on my shelf. It's called Crisis in Technology. Do you remember that book?
I never saw the book, but I never met John. But one of my classmates went to work for Cambridge Technology Group, which was his sort of first entrepreneurial endeavor, and they split into two chunks. John kept CTG, and CTP spun out and did its own thing. And ironically enough, I went to college with his daughter, so I had like two different ways to sort of be connected to John, although I never knew him.
It just shows the networking thing. You just never know where things cross here. Because I worked for a company that he wrote about in the book that was a large crisis in technology, which I lived through. But we won't go into that. So. But today we're going to talk about high consequences cyber. What do you mean by that?
So I think of high consequence cyber as the kinds of decisions that you need to make as a CISO that can make or break you. Things that may be really, really important and consequential to the firm that you work for and to the people you advise or manage, right? So for example, and we've seen this recently in the headlines. About SolarWinds and some of the recent developments there, right? How much risk do you put in front of senior management to deal with? How much do you report on? That's a high consequence decision about where you put where your risk appetite ought to be. How do you report to the board on your progress? What are the risk indicators that you want to use? Because you can't put 1,000 metrics in front of them. You really need to be very judicious about it. So, that's kind of one example. And then there's technology-oriented consequential decisions. So, for example, you may have exposure in a foreign geography, perhaps one that may be hostile to you or may have designs on your industrial secrets, potentially. You may have offices there. How do you split your network, right? And how do you do it in an intelligent way that doesn't also break your culture? Right, so that's again a high consequence decision. You may have a new security capability or new staff on board. What's the right size? How do you structure it? Right? How do you know whether you're investing enough? Whether you've got the right focus areas, and things like that. Right. So and then there's some sort of obvious ones like I've got an exposed perimeter. How do I get rid of all this risk? Do I even know where it is? How do I find it and get rid of it as expeditiously as possible and show off the company in the best light, because you've got investors, you've got clients, you've got partners that are all checking you out and wanting to know what's going on with you, and oftentimes you see that those some of the companies that do ratings, for example, or are looking for externally observable signals. What is going on inside may not. You want the outside to look as good as what you're doing inside, and vice versa. So these are all examples, and I think that just the key is, where does it matter? Where do you want to spend your time as a CISO, and where do you want to make sure that you have to get it right?
The world is changing, including how we work. As business shifts from on-prem legacy systems to the cloud, how will you safeguard your organization? It all starts with identity that is intelligent, autonomous, and constantly adapting to your changing environments. Savient Enterprise Identity Cloud is the only identity platform designed to accelerate your cloud initiatives and solve the toughest security and compliance challenges. Built on the principles of Zero Trust, Savient centralizes visibility and risk management, ensuring that the right identities get the right access to the right resources at the right time. Visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/Savient for a demo of the only identity platform CISOs need. Do you find that CISOs today are afraid to bring these high-risk projects to the board with what's been happening with the SolarWinds case, the Uber case, and I've interviewed both Tim Brown and Joe Sullivan on this podcast. We've also had the Equifax CISO has also been on our series as well. And so are they pulling back? Do you think in these types of efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on Joe and Tim in particular, either their circumstances or their approach on stuff. What I would say is that you have choices about where you spend your time and how you account for the time that you spent. And it's not like you won't have opportunities to brief the board on your key initiatives. Like you'll have that opportunity. You'll be given time to do it. It's a question of whether you're spending that time in a way that helps educate and inform, such that you can become a trusted partner. And I've heard it said, and I'm really not referencing either of these two examples in general, but my observation is that most boards trust their CISOs because they have to, right? They do a good job hiring and screening and looking for leadership talent, and they trust them because they have to, until the point where they can't. And in some cases, it all ends a little more quickly than you might think. And that's and unfortunately the challenge for CISOs, and I have a lot of empathy for both Joe and Tim, is because again they have opportunities to air out their dirty laundry, to put their risk ledger into view, right? To put key risk indicators that are indicating whether they're making progress or not. And those are often hard to do. Are they hiring fast enough? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do they have the right skills in the right seat? Is their pile of risk getting bigger? It's always big. Is the pile that they know about getting bigger or smaller? Is the right velocity? Do they need help, right? And I think that's the thing that's struck me in a couple of these recent incidents is, it's not like the risks weren't known, it's that they weren't getting fixed fast enough. And oftentimes getting help, reducing that pile of work is the key thing. One of the things I look at from a measurement standpoint is I look at velocity, right? So you've got an issue and you say, okay, well, somebody could go into an office and drop a Raspberry Pi with a battery pack and a cellular modem and into the environment, and they could radio home, and because we have a flat network, they can get to all sorts of stuff, right? That may concern you, or it may not, right? You may say, well, our physical infrastructure is really good, we're not so worried about that kind of infiltration. Or you might know that maybe you've got an office where that's not the case, and you actually are worried about that type of scenario because you've got some committed threat actors or adversaries you're worried about. So the remedies for that are pretty well known, right? And you may put that on the risk ledger and say, this is an important thing that we have to do, but it's maybe not as urgent, right? So you're saying, this is the Stephen Covey thing, importance and urgency, right? Important, but maybe not as urgent. Okay, well, if it's important and high risk, we're going to say anything like that is going to take us 2 quarters to fix. We'll start planning, we'll fix, right? You'll have a bunch of those on your ledger. And if you're retiring them, it's you've retired it. Are you retiring them at the speed that you want to see, right? Which is everything high risk gets retired in 2 quarters or less. Everything high urgency gets retired in 7 days or less, what have you, right? So it's are you going as fast as you should? There's a velocity you can measure on that. And so that's part of what I look at. And some of those long tail items where maybe you've given yourself more time, or they're seemingly less urgent, but they might have a hanging, some tail risk associated with it. Those are sometimes the things that are really harder to see. So hopefully that gives you a sense.
It's really nice to hear you mention that matrix, because I actually put that matrix in the CISO Compass book for how we look at the different vulnerabilities that we have and how to fix. But what you've added to that is something that I was uncovering, was the velocity, was how much time are we taking in each of those quadrants, and are we really measuring ourselves that we're actually getting this stuff completed.
Yeah, it's and this is I stole this from the people who do warehouses, right? If you go to like an Amazon warehouse, right, and they sell you all kinds of stuff: toothpaste, toilet paper, cereal, and then they'll sell you other stuff that nobody's going to buy, right? But maybe a few people are going to buy, right? And so in classic logistics fashion, and this is where I started my career even before I got into IT, was transportation and warehouse management. You've got your A goods, right? And those A goods, you're going to turn that entire inventory over like 10 times a year, 12 times a year, 20, 100 times a year, right? So there's a speed with that. the stuff that's really obscure, like I'm not even going to bother to try and make something up here, but like, I don't know, a fluorescent yellow brass coated towel rack. Who knows, right? You might sell one of those a year, so your turn rate on that is low. But in each one of those cases, you can say, are my A parts, or to extend the analogy, my A risks or my A vulnerabilities going as fast? I expect them to transit through 4 times a month, right? Every 7 days, right? 4 times a month. Are they going 4 times a month or 48 times a year? If they're not, then we're not pedaling fast enough, right? And so the other thing I like about it is you kind of get people interested in going faster, right? Faster is always good. So congratulations, you're speeding.
What popped into my mind was I used to work in a grocery store, was my first job. And
that's it.
And I'm thinking of the mincemeat. That people would make mincemeat pies at Thanksgiving. And so if you didn't sell the mincemeat, they were the same jars that the next year had all the dust on them on the bottom shelf, because nobody was buying that stuff any other time of year. And so, they just sat there. So when we're looking at bringing these projects, to the board, and how much of this is I'm not moving fast enough, or I'm not focusing on the right things, versus I'm not getting the funding that really needed, or are CISOs getting the funding, but we're just not solving the right problems? Where do you think this lies?
I think it's both, right? I mean, there are some great spending surveys out there. One of the ones that's more in depth, the IANS and Artico folks just did a spending survey, and they're showing that budgets for the I think I'm going to probably misquote this, but on balance are flat. A few are up, and a few more are down, right? And I think that's more of a function of the economy. Cyber budgets have had this upward trend for years and years and years, right? And it's been a wonder to me that we haven't seen a little bit of resistance from a funding standpoint. I think the issue on funding is some of it's product, right? Like everybody buys product for different things, products and services, but usually 60 to 70% of most expense is people. And that's, I think, there's been some resistance in hiring, certainly the last couple of quarters to year, just I think out of an abundance of caution because of the macroeconomic concerns. So I think funding's a thing. I think staffing is a thing. And, candidly, if you've got a decision to make where you say, well, I've got a lot of legacy infrastructure and I'd like to, for example, I've got edge infrastructure running my VPN connections, right? And we've been using an appliance for years, and we intend to move that to a cloud-managed or a software-defined networking type solution, a more virtualized solution. It sounds like a great idea, but it's going to take work to do. It's probably going to take you 2 or 3 quarters to fully implement, and it's going to take real money, right? And you may need consultants, and you may need to surge staff or whatever. So it's easier to say, well, maybe I'll push that into next year. Right. So there is definitely some soft deferrals on some of these larger projects that I think has been true recently. I don't think it's exactly funding really, but it's a question of if I've got $1 to spend on customer retention or wallet retention on the customer service size, and a $1 to spend on maybe infrastructure build out and improvements, you might look after your customers first, right? So I think sometimes that's at the board where you tend to see some of these where push comes to shove. The trick for CISOs, right, is to you always need to say, well, what's changed about my threat environment? What's changed about the macro environment that makes this need just as urgent and maybe more so than it was before? And that's partly a framing and a storytelling job. And in some cases, it's a data job where you want to put up the data to show that there really is a need.
So how does somebody go to the board with these high risk projects like, moving into the cloud, or, a multinational, changing of the network, and try get funding for these initiatives while still giving them the comfort that the security program is being well run?
Yep. I'd say two things. I think first is you can never go wrong talking about what your peer set is doing. So you may know because you've got connections, or you've got, or via industry groups, you may know what the state of practice is, and we'll use like the foreign office problem just as a for instance. You may know that other firms in your peer set have decided to geographically isolate certain parts of their network, right? And you may even know something about their approach, right? And to say, well, we've got 10 competitors in our peer set, and fully 5 of them are quite far down the path, and we know of a few more projects that are getting started here, and we've got a few laggards. And guess what? We're one of them, right? That's a story you can tell, right? To say, well, maybe a little more urgency would be good here. The other side of it is there's always what's the unique risk profile of the place you work at that makes it more urgent or less, right? In some cases, less. You may have more exposure revenue-wise, in this case, to a particularly difficult geo, right? You may have, you may have a larger workforce there, or you may have a history of incidents or other concerns that may cause you to put some particular urgency there. So looking at your individual threat profile, both on your own history, as well as just unique specifics to your business and exposure, also helps make the case. So that I'd say those two macro points, right? Which is, can I keep up with the Joneses? Am I keeping up with the Joneses? And then, is there something really specific about me or our firm that makes it more acute or more urgent?
So speaking of the Joneses today, with all the focus on identity, as the new perimeter and zero trust and moving to the cloud, where should we be focusing our efforts?
It's a great question, Todd. And if we're talking about zero trust, I always have to give a shout out to my former colleague John Kindervag. And my joke, which I never fail to repeat, is that every time I say zero trust, I have to pay him a royalty because he came up with the phrase while we were both analysts at Forrester. But all seriousness, like zero trust, what it really means is that you're spreading your risk around by authenticating and authorizing different pieces of your network, and doing so in such a way that you're not overly exposed with any one piece, right? So one of the really interesting things that's happening with authentication, and you've seen all the identity vendors advertise this, is passwordless. Now, that's the sizzle, right? To say, hey, you don't like the 16-character password that you got to change every 30 days. Never mind that 90-day change thing is out of favor, but a lot of companies are still doing it, right? That the sizzle is like, wouldn't you like to never have to type in a password again? That would be cool, right? The reality isn't quite there, but that's the sizzle. The stake is that in order to get there, you have to implement a new style of credentials that are effectively phish-proof, right? So these are the FIDO standard is the important one here. And what that means is you've got a secret with a cryptographic challenge that's usually bound to a device. So that means, on your iPhone, which has a secure element, if you have a FIDO compliant credential, it's actually in the secure hardware. And it can't be extracted, right? And so when you authenticate using that iPhone by, using Face ID or something, you're unlocking that credential with your face, which is quite secure. And there's been some nice industry research on face identification as being superior to fingerprint. But you've got that root of trust where you're rooting a credential that's in hardware. You're sort of bootstrapping it with your own face, effectively, and you're then presenting it to an authentication service. You can then cascade a whole bunch of other things off of that. So that includes your enterprise SSO, your entitlements, and so on. So this is going to be a journey, and I wouldn't say that the tech is all here. I think even the knowledge is here. It's unevenly distributed. I don't think all the expertise is fully percolated throughout all the organizations yet, but it's coming, and it's going to be great when we finally get it rolled out, because it's going to make it way better. A password is something you can write on a sticky note, as we all know, but it can also be guessed. It can be brute force. Some of these new credentials can't be brute forced or guessed, right? So it's a win-win-win. It's a win for usability, it's a win for security, and it's a win for integrity. So it's a great thing, and we're just at the beginning parts of it. But like, honestly, if I were rebuilding an identity program from scratch, I would start from the design criteria that we should be doing passwordless as a core part of the design, because it then forces you to sort of work the rest of the problem, right? And while it's hard, it can and should be really rewarding.
Well, and I think if we look at consumers as driving, the demand, and now people have their Apple devices and they're using Face ID and they're getting into all their other applications, and then they come into the workplace and it's like, well, why do I have to remember all these passwords? So I it's kind of we better hurry up and get there, right?
I like to joke that one of my close family members has single sign-on because she uses the same password everywhere. And I think that's a lot of people's default, So whatever we replace this with, it's got to be better than that. It's got to be easier than that.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Well, this has been great. What final advice would you give to emerging CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs, as they're trying to bring their, high risk, high profile, high consequences cyber, things into the organization?
I think step one, keep your chin up. It's actually kind of a tough time to be a CISO right now, because the economic headwinds have meant that not every program's gotten funded as well as it might have been. You've got the regulatory scrutiny. The SEC action has been incredibly enervating in the CISO community in general, right? And the threats don't stop. So all those things have made it really hard. But so, number one, keep your chin up. I think number two, protect yourself, right? And just there are some excellent guides out there now for CISOs to use. I'll mention two. One of them is from friends at Team8. They've got a very good guide around what CISOs need to know. I'm going to butcher the title, but what CISOs should have from a protection standpoint. And CINET also put out an excellent publication as well about what you need, ranging from things like indemnification to employee agreements, to visibility with senior management, to the ability to have greater enhanced sign-off on things. If there's one thing that's coming out of some of the recent regulatory events, if anything, it will probably strengthen the hand of the CISO a bit. But all that's going to be subject to how the business regards the function. But I think in general, it's increasing the pressure, but it's also increasing the visibility of the need. And so those are all good things. So I close on my prior advice: keep your chin up, stay visible, tell stories, explain. Mm-hmm. Always remember that part of your duty is to educate, and keep hiring. Because the talent market's scarce out there.
I think that's great advice. I mean, we have 1,100 CISOs in the Cybersecurity Collaborative and Forums business as part of what sponsors this podcast, which is a Cyber Risk Alliance resource to really bring information to CISOs and to work on those problems collectively. Because I like what you said. We can't do this by ourselves. We need to learn what other people are doing. Our organizations expect us to know what other people are doing as well. So I appreciate that. We try to share as much information, insights from people like yourself on CISO Stories. So thanks a lot for taking the time, Andy.
Thanks, Todd. I really appreciated the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to Savient, our diamond sponsor, and Bitwarden, our sapphire sponsor. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.